So welcome back to the layout. In this video we're going to be working on the block of flats that sits behind the scrapyard scene, and I'm just going to be adding a few extra details to it that I'd always planned to when I finished the initial stage of this building. The building was never 100% finished, and I always intended to come back and add additional details to it, as it always looked a little bit plain and a little bit dull. And while it will always look plain and dull, because it's a nasty tower block, it did need a little bit of personalisation and individuality adding to the various flats. So let's go back to the workbench a couple of weeks ago when I started making a few additions and improvements to this building. So here we are back at the block of flats that I built, well, a couple of years ago now, and this was my first sort of proper serious scratch build on a decent scale. I'd built little sheds and workshops and things prior to this, but this was the first sort of big project. I did do a video all about it. There's a link for that in the description if you want to check it out. It was a bit of an ordeal putting it all together, lots of parts, lots of bits and bobs. As you can see, it is quite large, but generally really happy with how it came out, and over the past couple of years it's turned into a bit of a focal point for the scrapyard side of the layout, forming a nice backdrop for the sort of grotty urban scene that I'm trying to build. The intention was to always come back to this block of flats and add extra details and bits and pieces. It currently has no weathering whatsoever, and there's no personality to the individual flats. It's lacking curtains and blinds, and I think it would really benefit from some lighting. So I'm just going to continue basically where I left off a couple of years ago and sort of get this thing a little bit closer to completion. So I've made a good start on the curtains and blinds, and as you can see it just gives a little bit of personality to the building and a little bit of variety. It's broken up the sort of tone of things, and I think it looks a lot better. It's almost impossible to film installing these, but I'll show you how I've done it. So for about 50% of the curtains in the building I've used these curtains from Scale Model Scenery. Quite simple, just simply printed onto paper. I didn't bother with these ones, I felt those were a bit posh for a tower block, but these ones certainly came in handy. The only issue is these are all black and white, so if you put all of these into a structure it will look incredibly monotone and dull. So I've only used a selection of them just to sort of give a general feel for things, and then what I've done in addition to those is using some pieces of coloured card from bits of packaging. In a similar manner to some of my previous structures, I've then made a series of additional curtains and blinds, and that's added a splash of colour to the building. As you can see, the curtains look quite effective, but the addition of some bits of card, such as those maroon ones there, these beige ones, even just a bit of white paper, really helps. And you can imagine if the entire building just had these installed, whilst they look effective, it would look as though it was all black and white. When I originally built the structure, I divided it into various flats, and you can see that just adds a nice bit of structure to the building, helps it stay nice and strong, and as a result of having this now for a couple of years, I've not noticed any warping or any major issues with it. As you can see, all of the curtains and blinds, whether they're the Scale Model Scenery ones or scrap pieces of card, have just been glued to the inside face of the building just there. And by gluing those in different positions and cutting out different sizes, you can create blinds and curtains that are either fully drawn, partially drawn, or almost completely open. So another evening is drawing to a close, and as you can see I've got a little bit further concerning the lighting for this building. Once again, this is quite difficult to film, so I'll give you an overview of what I've done and we'll have a quick look at it in operation. So the building is currently upside down. Imagine this is the baseboard. You've got your two wires coming in here, 12 volts, positive and negative. Those are going into some brass rod, which is from Albion Alloys, and I use the brass rod inside the buildings to act as a bit of a bus bar to distribute a nice sturdy wiring loom throughout the building without getting loads of flexible wire all tangled up inside the various rooms. And as you can see, that bus bar, positive and negative, runs through the various floors of the building all the way to the top floor. And there you can see we've got some surface mount LEDs glued to the ceiling of various rooms. I tend to glue them randomly and try to never more than light 50% of the building. I think the buildings look quite realistic with 50% or less of the rooms lit. Look at any skyline at night in a city or town and you'll notice that an awful lot of the buildings have empty dark rooms. So going back to the wiring, we've got positive and negative 12 volts DC running through the various floors, and then you can see the LEDs are pre-wired. I get these LEDs from eBay, I'll leave a link in the description. These are the warm white variety, but I always adjust the colour temperature with some paint afterwards. I'll show you that shortly. And you can see each wire for the LED, positive and negative, is just soldered to the appropriate piece of brass rod, whether it's positive or negative. Of course, this is a large building, so that then runs to another set going into the centre of the building. Various LEDs installed in there as well, and a similar story at the far end. And that just keeps things really nice and simple. The building at the end of the day only has 2 wires coming out of it. They run to the bus wire underneath the layout that supplies 12 volts DC to the various buildings on the layout, and each building only having 2 wires is just nice and easy to remove from the layout for any reason. Now you can see quite a few of the windows on the building are lit, and I'm quite pleased with the effect on that. I will be blanking off some of these windows in their entirety just to add a little bit of variation to the building, as each LED is lighting up a complete flat. Obviously in real life, if these were proper flats, then let's take a look at this one down here. The window to the right would be a bedroom or a living room or something, and the window to the left with the door onto the balcony would probably be the kitchen or something like that. You would most likely have a dividing wall running between those 2 rooms. Obviously I've got the LED lighting that whole section, so if we were to blank one of those windows off with a bit of black card, it would just make things look a little bit more authentic. And although I've not changed the colour temperature of the LEDs just yet, these are just straight out of the box, warm white. They're not bad, but they're still a little bit white and clinical for the type of effect I'm going for. But even in this state, the building does look quite brutalist and imposing, which is certainly what I was going for. I've made a bit more progress on the outside of the building, and it's going to be relatively difficult to pick out on camera, but basically what I've done is just continue some of the filler work that I've been doing around the various white sections on the building, just to blend things in together and just get the structure just looking a little bit neater and tidier. To do that, I've used some of the Deluxe Materials Perfect Plastic Putty. Quite good stuff, very fine, easy to sand, easy to shape, and it dries quite quickly too. I then sanded that down with a selection of sandpaper which I borrowed from work, mostly using 3M 400 grit paper, before finally running over the various bits of the structure with some Vallejo flat white paint just to tie things together. And I'm quite pleased with the appearance. It's just got rid of some of the gaps and some of the little bits of plastic that were a little bit poorly fitting. It's difficult to see on camera, but there are areas of the filler work that could benefit from another skim and another little bit of sanding, but rather what I've done is I've sort of left it looking a little bit rough and sort of organic around the edges. These structures, when they were new, were not well built, and with my layout being set in the 1980s, this particular structure would have been at least 20 years old by that time, so frost damage to the concrete, bits of render and plaster that have fallen off and been poorly patched in, dodgy bits of paintwork here and there all adds to the authenticity of the building. These things were certainly not particularly well made, and it's why there aren't as many of them left today versus how many were knocking around 30-40 years ago. I've done the same thing around the top of the structure. You can see I've applied some filler just to unify all the plastic and the cardboard, given it a coat of white paint, and just gone around the whole top of the structure. That's tidied it up quite nicely, but once again it maintains that sort of rough and ready appearance. This area of the building will be subject to quite a lot of abuse from the weather and the sun, so it's not going to be perfect, and for just that reason I've deliberately made it look a little slapdash. So next I'll focus on doing some of the roof detail on the building. I've done an awful lot of flat roof buildings on the layout so far, and mostly what I've done with those is go for the sort of felt roof appearance. This particular one I'm going to go for a sort of gravel or cinders finish, just to add a bit of variety to the layout, as I'm conscious quite a few of my buildings are now starting to look the same on the roof. So we'll stick some fine ballast down on the roof of this structure and see how that looks. I left the ballast overnight to dry. That's now rock hard. So next thing to do is to start looking at some of the lighting and adjust the colour temperature. I think the building could do with a little bit more of that 1980s orange tint. I've applied with a small brush a single coat of the Tamiya X26 clear orange to the just the top of the LEDs just there, and you can see even with the lights on in the room how it's just given the LEDs a bit more of a warm sort of orange tone, which is much more in keeping with how lighting used to be 30 years ago. Using a bit of card, I've also completely blanked off a couple of windows from the inside. I made sure to paint that card black before I glued it onto the inside surface, and that will just better disperse the randomness of the lighting throughout the building, and it will be clear then that each section that's lit is not necessarily a two-window section. So it just breaks things up a little bit and stops patterns forming in the lighting on the front of the building. I'm trying to get it as random and as sort of natural as possible. And there you can see with the light switched on how things just look a little bit more random. So this window up here has been blanked off before. All four of these windows were lit in a sort of nice neat little row, and just by blanking that off really just helps things out. This window here had a full blind across it. I've actually put a piece of card behind that as well, as a little bit too much light was coming through and it looked a little bit strange. And it's just helped distribute the lights a little better, and you can see probably about, I don't know, 40% or so of the building is lit, which is fairly convincing for real life. I've been thinking a little bit more about interior detail, and the more I look at it, the more I'm coming to the conclusion it would just be a waste of effort. As you can see, looking at the building there, it's very hard to see inside the rooms that are even lit, and what you can see through those windows doesn't look overly unpleasant, and it's not like there's a big gaping hole behind there lacking in detail. I think if I was to do interior detail, it would be mostly lost on the building, and this has been the case for some other structures where I've put effort into interior only to switch the lights on and come to the conclusion that actually I could have got those 4 hours of my life back. So for the time being, I shall leave it alone, and while it's not off the table and I'll continue to think about it, for the purposes of what I need to do with just updating this structure a little bit and giving it a bit of extra detail, I think that's just fine. Looking from this angle, once again, you can see just the addition of the curtains has given the rooms that bit of personality that they needed, and I think an interior would be rather lost. I have started to add a couple of details to the outside of the building in the form of some washing and some plants. Very difficult to see and even more difficult to film, but hopefully you can see there's a few towels and things draped over that balcony edge just there. Up on the floor above you can see there's some plants that are just sitting in a little sort of planter box that's been screwed to the inside of the balcony wall that you sometimes see. It's got somebody sat up there on a chair as well. Over here we've got a bloke at the balcony, some more washing and some more plants, and I've also got a washing line over here. I'm just in the process of painting a couple of those bits. The clothes that are hanging from the washing line are just made from pieces of toilet tissue that have just been saturated with the paint so that they sort of conform to the sort of shape that I'm looking for. The washing line itself is just a small piece of brass rod. On the floor above, once again, you can see we've got just a couple of plants there in some boxes that are screwed to the insides of the balcony if they were real. These are just made from little bits of ground cover for the main sort of countryside scenery on the layout that I do, and these particular flowers I just got from eBay. I forget the name of the manufacturer, but there's lots of different places that sell various types of foliage, and really all this stuff is static grass with a little bit of coloured flock glued to the top of it. But if you cut a few pieces off and place them carefully with some tweezers, it can look quite effective. The gravel on the roof has now dried, and while it needs a little bit of extra stuff putting onto it, I'm quite pleased with how that's come out. It's really tidied up the top of the building. It looks a lot better, and I think now a bit of weathering and maybe a few more plants and a couple more maybe bits of detail with the washing, and I think we'll call it there. I'll put a TV aerial as well on the building somewhere, but nothing too crazy. It would be very tempting to cover this building, especially on the balcony section, with satellite dishes. That's something that is very commonly seen, and certainly today, if you look at any one of these sort of tower blocks that's still in existence, you'll see all kinds of external cabling and TV receiving equipment that has been fixed to the front of the building. As usual, I've conducted a fair bit of research into the time period that I'm modelling with regards to a building like this, and certainly from the numerous pictures that I've found, it just wasn't the case back in the 1980s. While satellite television did exist, it was generally received on quite large, bulky dishes, and the service was very expensive and somewhat niche and hard to find. The likelihood of a tenant living in one of these flats having the disposable income to enjoy satellite television in 1988 would have been unlikely. As a result of that, almost all of the pictures that I have found during that decade of buildings like this show them to be very plain on the front, with no external cabling and very little in the way of signal receiving equipment. So in light of that research, I'll be leaving the front of this building pretty much as is, and I think all it needs now is a subtle weathering. Tower blocks like this, of course, get dirty, and certainly over the decades they would have got dirtier. This one's next to a railway line, so there's a chance that there was a bit of grime and stuff over the front of this building. But once again, I've put a lot of effort into the building. I'm quite pleased with its appearance, and I don't really want to spoil it by covering it in filth. Once again, all the research I've done shows these blocks, even in poor condition, to be somewhat clean, with only the concrete sections really showing any signs of age and dirt. Brickwork tended to look a lot fresher for a surprisingly long period of time. For the weathering, I'm going to keep it fairly simple. I'm just going to be using some of the Vallejo black, and I'm going to be thinning that very, very heavily to a very, very fine wash. And I'm just going to go over the majority of the white sections of the building with the wash and rub off a couple of little bits that look a little too intense, and then maybe we'll finish up with some weathering powder. So there we go, using a combination of the wash and a little bit of the Tamiya Weathering Master weathering powder set. I've just taken the edge off of the building just there, and you can see it's not absolutely filthy, but it's got that sort of 20-30 year old appearance that you would expect some of the white concrete to have gained during that time. The weathering will become more clear when it's back up on the layout underneath the correct lighting, but hopefully you can sort of get the idea there that it's just sort of taken the sheen off of the building and it doesn't look quite so new anymore. So I've just put the tower block back into position on the layout, fed the wires through a hole in the baseboard and just connected those to the bus wire, the 12-volt feed that I have running around the room to power the various lighting features. As I said earlier, the weathering is particularly subtle, which is what I was intending, but hopefully you can pick out the slightly run-down nature of the building and see some of the streaking of the black wash down the brickwork and all over the white concrete. This tower block's always been a bit of a focal point for this side of the layout, and I think it looks a lot better now. It's got some curtains and some personality to it, and just little details like the washing hanging over the balconies and stuff like that. It's all small, subtle stuff, but it's certainly taken away some of the blandness to the building, and I think it looks a lot more at home. I've also made sure to run the black wash over some of the window panes, and I was generally quite careless when I applied the weathering. I just went over the whole building, so the windows are a bit grubby, but once again this is basically impossible to see on camera, but in the flesh it is noticeable. I've also applied a sheet of black card to the rear of the building, and that's just so that when the lights are on you can't see the back scene through the windows. With the lights on, I'm very pleased with how it's looking. It's got that nice moody appearance that was very typical of the time period, with the orange tint to the lights. You can see in contrast with these two other lit buildings, the small office block and the signal box, how the lighting is much more of an orange sort of colour, and you can see how sort of white, even a warm white LED does look. These particular buildings I've not really done anything to in terms of the lighting temperature, and that'll be one of my next to-do jobs, just to sort of tone that down, make them look a little bit more convincing. Of course, there's more things I can add to the building in future, and certainly something I'll be getting round to is adding perhaps a low relief sort of roof access building. That might just break up the sort of flat appearance at the top of the building, and it gives me somewhere to mount one or two TV aerials in a similar manner to some of the pictures that I've found during my research. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'll leave you with a few running shots as always, and I'll be back as soon as I can when I've made some more progress on the next bit.